Hi all, welcome back to 5WH. I'm Joe, a former security analyst, and I'm going to continue bringing you foreign affairs events from off the beaten track. We'll be sticking to the 5WH format, which is what, who, where, when, why, and how. These are often considered to be the sort of core questions to journalistic information gathering, and I figure they're a good basis for all of us to learn something about what's going on. What I'd like you to do is sit back, relax, enjoy, and if you do all of those things, like, follow, subscribe, etc. Right, without further ado, let's crack on. So I'm going to jump in now with our what. Russia held a series of regional and local elections across the country, covering approximately a third of administrative districts. In total, 78,000 positions were up for grabs, and sadly but unsurprisingly, all 20 of the governorships that were available were taken by candidates closely affiliated with the regime, and all of their results were sufficiently high as to avoid the need for any runoff elections or second rounds. Despite this, however, opposition parties appear to have gained ground, seizing majorities in the regional parliaments in Tomsk, Tambov, and Novosibirsk. All of this in the face of widespread reports of electoral fraud, although I feel I must point out that the regime has, naturally enough, denied all of these reports. I think given the circumstances, any success for opposition parties is noteworthy, so we're going to have a bit of a deeper look. So moving on to the who then. Got a few people, individuals and groups to cover here, and some of this is a bit counterintuitive from a Western perspective, so please bear with me. So we're going to jump in first and sort of talk about the opposition groups in the Russian elections. Unlike Republicans and Democrats in the States or Conservatives, Labour and Lib Dems in the UK, even the opposition groups, the official opposition parties in Russia, are essentially in cahoots with Putin's regime. It's a system called managed democracy, the idea being that through manipulation of the media and the voting environment, you can reduce the odds of opposition people getting into power by denying them access to a party machine. So it's a bit of a mess. So what we really need to consider here is the non-systematic opposition, if you will. So the networks of individual candidates spread throughout the country, standing individually for their positions, but with the tacit understanding that they are anti-regime, as opposed to, for example, communist candidates who are widely seen in local parliaments to ally themselves with the United Russia Party, which we'll come on to later. The opposition also has a series of other issues affiliated with it. Because of this systematic/non-systematic divide, in addition to simply the party badge or rosette people are wearing, there can be a tendency to sweep all of the non-systematic opposition into a single group, which, depending on the political views of the person observing it, can be observed as either a far-right group or radically pro-Western liberals. In fact, I think we need to consider that neither of these is the truth. It is simply that due to the nature of the system, everyone who is not in cahoots with the regime is gathering together essentially for survival and strength in numbers, and that does sometimes make for some somewhat unlikely bedfellows, with far left and far right and, centrists attending the same events because they're united by the anti-regime sentiment. What we can take from that, though, is that any vote for a candidate should not be taken necessarily to endorse their individual political leanings, but more a reflection on the voters' view against the regime. So I can't really discuss opposition groups without mentioning Alexander Navalny. Really key character in these elections, despite the fact he's been in an induced coma for the last 3 weeks due to the Russian regime trying to poison him with a nerve agent. He's a prolific anti-corruption blogger, formerly a political party member, currently sort of existing in his own little fringe, and he is arguably the central character in this non-systematic opposition movement. He's routinely harassed by the regime. He's suffered poisoning attempts before. He's routinely victimized by intimidation and other similar measures. And tellingly, he was flying back from Siberia, where most of the opposition wins were, at the time he was poisoned. So we'll probably address this a little bit more later. We've also got a couple of other key characters worth knowing about. We've got Andrei Fetiv. Again, apologies for my pronunciation. He's a key Navalny ally and now a newly elected council member for Tomsk. I've also got Sergei Boyko, the likely winner of a seat in Novosibirsk, although some of the election results are still pending clarification. It's looking good for him. So now we get to address the regime. We may as well start at the top. Let's jump in with Putin. Honestly, if you've stumbled across this podcast, knowing what its tags are, I probably don't need to say much in the way of an introduction to Putin, but I'm in a belt and braces mood, so I'll rattle through some key details. Vladimir Putin is the current president of the Russian Federation, having first been elected president in 1999 and having remained in power, if not necessarily in position, to the present day. Briefly served as prime minister between 2008 and 2012 in order to skirt Russia's constitutional term limits, but Dmitry Medvedev's presidency is widely considered to have been firmly under Putin's thumb. Indeed, Medvedev did not seek re-election for any second term. He just stepped down and allowed Putin to reassume the office. Probably a pretty safe assumption there. Putin remains allegedly above politics, being not directly affiliated with any single party. However, the party of the regime, as you may call it, as United Russia, it has no other leader and it is de facto Putin's. An interesting point with United Russia is that it has no clear party platform. It's nominally conservative, it's pro the Russian Orthodox Church, it's rabidly homophobic in terms of its policy platform, but its method of winning elections is essentially to put a rosette, metaphorically, on a given candidate or politician that is supportive of the regime, and then use their media and political machine in order to get that person elected. With that considered, their public policy positions should always be viewed through this lens. It's not necessarily about what they want to enact as what will get them people elected. There's not necessarily a connection between the mandate they seek and what they'll do in power. It's also worth touching on that a party called New People has recently been allowed to come into being with the Kremlin's support. It is unclear what effects this will have, but it appears likely that it's an effort to diversify the Kremlin support base, given that unbiased reporting would strongly suggest that United Russia is highly unpopular and its electoral victories are maintained primarily through fraud. So now we get on to the when. Generally, elections in Russia are single-day events. However, this election is the first to have taken place over a course of days from the 11th to 13th of September 2020. The aim of this was to reduce crowd size and the associated COVID-19 threat that you'd get from large gatherings of people queuing. While this may be a perfectly sensible reason in other countries, given Russia's less than stellar reputation for free and fair elections, this has unsurprisingly been accompanied by a massively increased series of reports relating to voter fraud. This kind of goes without saying, but it will tie into what we're about to discuss in a minute. So where? Well, as the largest country by landmass on Earth, if you throw a dart at a map, you're more than likely to hit something relevant to this podcast. However, if you want to see a graphical representation of where all the elections were held, I can direct you to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I was going to cite Wikipedia, and then the ghost of university lecturers haunted me and told me not to. It's worth noting more specifically that the gains for the opposition were primarily further east, around Siberia, and it was flying out of, I think, Tomsk, where Navalny was poisoned. So there's probably not too much of a stretch to see some correlation and causation relationship there between where Navalny was operating and where the opposition has had most success in these elections. It would have been interesting, had he been granted a further 3 weeks to campaign, whether we would be seeing a wider series of opposition successes, but that is pure conjecture on my part. So now we're coming on to the why, and this is a bit of an open-ended issue with these elections. So I've tried to subdivide it into a few sub-questions, although I can't honestly suggest an answer for all of them. So the first one is, why do we get these results? The regime is reported to be extremely unpopular, yet United Russia or other Putin-leaning independents routinely win majorities in elections. Firstly, I think we need to go back to what we were considering when we were looking at the party itself. United Russia and the regime in general is ultra-broad church. What this means really is that it appeals directly to the non-ideological Russian voter. Primarily, you could argue its ideology, as far as it has one, is simply the acquisition and retention of power, rather than any particular policy platform as we may expect from perhaps a Western political party. This focus on power is then backed up by the state domination of the media. We might associate perhaps the BBC, for example, as being state media. In Russia, the atmosphere is very different. Any opposition media is likely to be shut down without legal recourse in pretty short order. Journalists are routinely beaten or murdered. And what this means is that even if you do have a sort of pseudo-independent media agency, they will self-censor in order to avoid these consequences. So, again, people may not be fond of the regime or United Russia, but there isn't really an alternative, and there is no permission structure to grant them that. On the other hand, however, opposed to the managed democracy, it might be worth considering the effects of poisoning Navalny. So it may be worth considering, again, purely as a point of conjecture, that the area in which Navalny was poisoned, i.e. Siberia, is also the region in which his opposition movement appears to have gained most momentum. Too early to see if that will carry on any further, but it is an interesting point to consider. Following this, then, we've got the question of, well, why did Putin, kind of permit the rise of the opposition in these areas? And the short answer is he didn't. It's a common thought among a lot of sort of pseudo-political observers in the West that they place Putin on this pedestal as a person who is all-powerful. Bluntly, he's not. The Russian state is highly centralized in that regard, particularly with the media environment. And this election highlights the limits of centralized power against specific and clustered local activism. So what were these opposition parties seeking to achieve, apart from, the acquisition of seats and power itself? I think realistically they're trying to demonstrate staying power. A key thing with providing a narrative that allows you to gain further political support is the idea that you'll persist beyond the immediate instance and in the face of pressure. I would argue there's not much greater means of demonstrating this than having your leader poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent and then continuing to then sweep up an electoral victory in the region in which that assassination attempt took place. And also, generally, they seek to provide a highly visible alternative to the regime so that people who are potentially sick of the corruption, the infighting, the sort of closed political system in Russia genuinely believe they may have an option and may then turn out to vote in future. Which is ultimately why this matters. Next year we have the parliamentary election across the whole of Russia, and this potentially demonstrates to us the tactics that the opposition may seek to use. Unfortunately, this also reveals their potential tactics to our good old friend Vlad, and it may see an increase in repressive actions over the next year as he attempts to repress the opposition and deny them the momentum they seem to be achieving. Ultimately, though, I think I alluded to a point earlier, this matters because it's potentially provided the opposition with a narrative and permission structure that enables people to vote for parties or individuals outside of this closed democratic, pseudo-democratic, I should say, bubble that Russia's created. It may also prove to potential candidates that they can actually win in the face of the state's opposition. It could likely lead us with a much more dynamic political environment in Russia moving forwards. So now we're going to jump on to a brief how. So what were the tactics of the opposition? Well, the key tactic Navalny was pushing was the idea of smart voting, what we in the West would just consider, or in the UK particularly would consider tactical voting. The idea that they set up a website where for I think about 1,000 candidates were supported by Navalny's movement, and if a voter in a given district logged onto that website, typed in their constituency, they would be told, vote for this person as the single anti-regime candidate that other people will be told to vote for as well. The idea being that you create a localized majority in order to win the seat. Clearly, it's worked. I think that also the point here is it's also placed a significant emphasis on smaller, localized, independent movements rather than a national movement that the Russian regime is much more adept at targeting and pointing at as another or as traitors or as anti-Russians or whatever, whereas focusing these campaigns on much more local issues allows them to function without directly drawing the ire of the state. However, on a national basis, this may actually go some way to tipping United Russia out of its majority. On the other hand, we've got the regime's tactics. We've already addressed some of these issues, particularly the fact they basically own the official opposition parties. But in addition to that, there's been widespread reporting of voter intimidation, direct acts of violence or intimidation towards election monitors and preventing them from gaining access to sites. Where election monitors have managed to gain access, I should point out legal access, a legally and constitutionally enforceable right. Where they've gained that access, they've then reported record levels of ballot stuffing and even the issuing of pre-completed ballot forms to voters. So I think given that context, these quite small wins are actually worthy of note and something we should be paying attention to. So now I guess it's time to wrap it up, and I think sadly this raises more questions than it does answers, but Russia is always a fascinating country to look into. A mix of cultures that do not, directly mesh onto the sort of Western perspective makes it particularly interesting. And I think we might look forward to a tempestuous year leading up to the parliamentary elections. So, thanks for listening in, folks. I hope you feel you're a bit more clued up on the ins and outs of Russian regional elections. If you'd like to hear more, please like, subscribe, whatever buttons the platform you're using has. It really matters. If you got directed to this by Twitter, please feel free to reply to the tweet. Let me know. All feedback is valid. Obviously, I'm very new at this. And I want to do better for you. Cheers. Thank you very much. Bye.